Hi there. Hello. Hi. Thanks for coming out in the rain. I just flew from Portland where it was very sunny, and it's nice to get back to Phoenix and get the rain. Thanks for coming here to part of our new series again, the third in our series of dialogues. A new program that Origins has created. I'm, by the way, Lawrence Krauss, in case you didn't know. I'm the director of the Origins. This is the first event of the year for us here, and we have a thematic program which we're calling this year Life and Death in the 21st Century. And it seemed what better way to start than talking about ethics in the 21st century, because as you'll see, that has to do with life and death. And what better way to start than bringing a remarkable thinker, Peter Singer, who's been called the most influential living philosopher in the world today, for good reason. Because Peter has a unique ability, more than anyone I know, living or dead, and that includes my mother, in fact, to make me feel like I should be better, that I have a long way to go. And every time I read anything he's written or talk to him, I have that sense that there's so much more that I can do, and we'll talk about that tonight. Now, what I also like about Peter is that he's not just an ivory tower scholar. He's an activist, a political activist, and he became extremely well known around the world in 1975 when his book Animal Liberation was published. It created a movement that we'll talk about tonight that has changed the way many people live. And in fact, I first came to know him around that time. I used to go to Aspen, Colorado, and where there's a physics center, and there's one of my favorite bookstores in the country is there, called the Explore Bookstore, and I've done signings for all my books there. And the woman who ran it was a wonderful woman named Catherine Thalberg, and the daughter of Irving Thalberg, for those people who like to watch the Academy Awards. And she and her husband were strongly influenced by Peter, and her husband was the mayor of Aspen. And those of you who are old enough may remember they had a campaign to ban furs from Aspen, which is, you know, like banning Catholics from the Vatican or something. And it was a very interesting program. Peter went out there to actually speak and lobby for that. And for that reason, by the way, I know that some of you, I'm going to hear this later, are maybe disappointed that I'm not wearing my Converse. But there's a reason. There's a reason, and this is in honor of Peter, because I want to show you that you can have leather shoes that aren't leather at all. They're no. Okay. But before I bring Peter out, I want to introduce. Peter's written about the fact animal liberation is important because not only can animals suffer, as we'll talk about, but they have sensibilities that many of us might imagine are quite human, sensibilities of fairness and fair play. And talking about that, he referred to some work of someone who's come to one of our other Origins events, actually last time Peter was here, Franz de Waal, famous primatologist. And I want to show you a little video that Peter's written about that has profoundly affected my life since I first saw it. And since really this is all about me, but it'll actually come and be relevant for later on. So in a second, I want to show it to you. Oh, good, that's me, not the primates. It involves these capuchin monkeys who normally can be taught to do tasks, and they like cucumbers. And why don't we run the video, because it's really kind of amazing. So I'll talk you through it. So here, you see, they return a rock and they get a cucumber. But this one here returns the same rock and is given a grape, and they like grapes a lot more. Okay, so watch this. Now this one returns the rock again. Sees the other guy get a grape. He gets a cucumber, and there we go. And it happens again. He's not too happy about that. But he'll do it. He'll give it one extra chance. This time, he doesn't even Look at it. It just goes right out again. Okay, so, and ever since I've seen this video, whenever something like this happens to me, I ask myself, am I really a monkey? I say, no, I'm not a monkey. And I think, well, maybe I am. And that's a good reason to bring out Peter Singer.
Thank you, Lawrence. We're both monkeys.
It's good, yeah, we're both monkeys.
Apes, anyway.
Apes. Great apes. Okay, well, we're going to go through a lot of things, and I've been cramming this week, and I want to start with the general and then go to the specific, and I want to talk about your work, of course, and I want to start personally. So you're a bright guy, so why philosophy?
Why philosophy? Well, if you want to ask the origins question,
yeah,
how
the
did
origins
I get
question.
into
Why are you a philosopher?
You know, I think it's one of these stories about just little, quite accidental things affect your life. I was going to be a lawyer, and you know, when you go up to universities, and I was in Australia where we study law as an undergraduate degree, straight out of high school. But you do some other subjects as well, and I wanted to do something, you know, like a humanities subject. I thought I'd probably do history. But it just so happened that my sister, I have a sister who's older than me, was going out with a guy who had done some philosophy and talked to me about it. And I really knew just about nothing about it because you didn't do any philosophy at high school. But it sounded really interesting. It sounded different from what I'd been doing. I kind of always enjoyed a good argument. I guess that's why I wanted to be a lawyer. But this was an even better argument in a way. You know, you get more into the fundamentals. So I thought, okay, I'll take the first year philosophy subject anyway. And I really just all went on from there. And it seemed to me both interesting and ultimately important.
And you've helped trying to make it important in the modern world. I wanted to hear that story because I think it's really, for the students in the audience, it's really amazing to me how a career can be based on kind of a small accident.
Absolutely. My sister had, you know, fancied some other guy. I might be a lawyer. Who knows?
Well, the world would be worse off. We don't need one more lawyer.
We don't.
But,
nothing against the lawyers in the audience, you know.
Yes. Well,
some of you do good jobs.
That won't be the only law joke tonight, so it's okay. So let's talk about philosophy, because you're to a specific type of philosophy, but what's your definition of philosophy?
So philosophy is an inquiry into some of the deepest, most fundamental questions about who we are, what the universe is really like, at the most ultimate level of reality. And the interesting thing about philosophy is it used to be much more all-embracing. So what is now physics, your area, used to be known as natural philosophy. What is now psychology was a branch of philosophy, even in the 20th century. There's still a philosophy journal called Mind, which was a journal of philosophy and psychology. It doesn't really publish any psychology now, because that's all hived off into experimental psychology. But it's the questions that now it's the questions that resist that kind of experimental scientific method that we have to pursue by way of rational argument and reflection rather than by experimentation.
Well, so in that sense, if science expands, then philosophy shrinks?
Yeah, you'd have to say, looking at it over the past hundreds of years, that philosophy has shrunk. That's true.
So if we extrapolate...
I'm out of a job.
Why will it disappear, and why? I know you don't think it will, so I want to hear your defense of it.
Because I think there are some questions where you cannot answer them by experimental method. So I'm working in ethics, and questions about how we ought to live, about what's right and wrong, what we ought to do in different situations. I don't think there's any way you can deduce that from a set of facts. There are still questions to be asked after you've got all the facts in. There's still questions to be asked and discussions to be had. And that's why I think that's going to continue, whatever progress science makes.
Well, we'll follow up on that, because I'm not 100% sure I agree, but let's see where we can go on that. You do agree, of course, that even in the area of ethics, the results of science dramatically change what we think are ethical principles, or at least impact on what we think are ethical principles.
Absolutely. I mean, we have to understand the consequences of what we're doing and science tells us the consequences of what we're doing, and without that, we wouldn't know. And also, of course, it changes the questions we ask in very interesting ways, because if we didn't have techniques, for example, we didn't have techniques of keeping alive some infants with very severe disabilities, then there was no question about whether we should or should not keep them alive.
But it's more than that. I think, and I know you've written about this, that the development of evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, and sociobiology have dramatically changed things, because they recognize that not only have humans evolved as biological creatures, but as intellectual creatures, and that therefore evolution, in some sense, has played a role. And I know, I was happy to see you agree with me. When Noam Chomsky was here, he disagreed with me, because he likes this Rousseauian notion that Rousseau wrote, man was born free but lives forever in chains. And in some sense, the point is we always lived in chains.
Yes, I mean, we obviously evolved from social mammals,
beings. We were never
beings.
The individual free man or woman.
That's a myth. The noble savage walking alone throughout the forest is a myth, I think. Where before we were alone, we were other primates, and we lived in groups. And yes, we evolved to live in groups, and that put certain social pressures on us and formed our nature and developed our ethics. In fact, if we'd lived alone, we wouldn't really have an ethics in the same sense.
Yeah, in fact, I think as you put it in one of your books, and I have them here if I want to quote, which I may do, that since we lived in groups, clearly before we were modern humans, that our actions were already constrained.
Yes. Yes, and we evolved certain predispositions, and you saw that in the video you saw, this sense of fairness that the capuchin monkeys have. So they evolved that. I mean, it wasn't that they got trained by Frans de Waal to have that. They evolved that for living in social groups. It's the sort of reciprocity that they have. For example, they may groom each other, right? So you very often get with primates, they have various things in their fur that they can't get rid of from their back, for example, might be lice or other insects. So they will present their back to another one, and that will groom them and pick it out. And once that one's done that, then he or she will do the same, sit in front of the other one and expect to be groomed. And if the other one doesn't do the grooming, then they get upset, because they have this sense that that's unfair. And it's because of that they have developed this reciprocity, which is, I think, something that is common to humans and to other social mammals.
In fact, reciprocal altruism. In fact, Darwin had a big problem. Clearly, altruism looked like it was a problem for evolution initially. Mm-hmm. Why, if you have selfish genes, why would you be altruistic? And of course, we tend, because our behavior is determined by evolution in a way, to first value our kin more, our family more than our kin, and then our group. And then maybe our society, and then maybe, if we can expand out to all humans, and then maybe even beyond that, we'll get there. And that clearly is a biological fact more than an innate.
So it's clearly a biological fact that we prefer the interests of our kin, because that helps our genes to survive in future generations, that we favour those with whom we're in these reciprocal relations of mutual benefit, and small group societies as well. Yeah, the puzzle for Darwin, and still a puzzle today, I would say, is how is it possible for people to be universally altruistic, to be altruistic to strangers, to complete strangers who can never reciprocate.
You used an example. I want to pick, because I disagree with it. You used an example of donating blood as sort of a universal kind of altruism. As that you give it to people you'd never know, and you get nothing back. I wanted to do a little experiment to see, because I disagree. I want to see it seems to me people donate blood because it's a perfect example of reciprocal altruism, it seems to me, because I donate blood because I hope if I'm ever in an accident that there'll be blood available for me. And I'm wondering, how many people here donate blood? How many people here don't, if they think of the reasons they do it, is it universal kindness, or are you motivated by the hope that maybe if you have an accident there'll be blood for you? I just want to see how, and be honest here.
Okay, so
if they're being honest, I'm wrong.
Hang on, okay. I want the universal altruists to show, right? Yeah, okay, there's quite a lot of them. And look, really, I mean, your explanation doesn't make sense, because
What?
I'm sorry. you know, unless you have a very different system here in Arizona from what I'm familiar with, you're no more likely to get blood if you're in an accident because you're a donor.
No, it's not that. It's the recognition that there's a supply. That if other people, if other people donate, then I recognize that they'll be...
But if you were just, you know, if you were just selfish, why not free ride, right? Why not say, you know, my 1 pint that I'm putting into the system isn't going to make any difference to how much blood there is?
Well, but you've talked, well, I don't want to belabor this, but in terms of reciprocal altruism, you point out, we all do things like grooming with the hope that we'll be groomed, and that's by an individual we know, but we don't necessarily think of it as self-interest. We think of it as something we want to do, but we may be motivated.
But we don't do it to strangers. The grooming stuff, we don't do to strangers. It's a small society. We know all of the other members of the society, or the monkeys or the chimpanzees or whatever do, and they expect to get it back, and they'll attack or get angry with the one who doesn't do it back. So I do think that there's a different explanation is needed for the fact that in a large society where you're donating to strangers, they don't know who gave them the blood, they can never reciprocate in that way. I think it is a different kind of altruism.
And maybe we'll get to it, but I don't want to jump ahead, but do you think you know where it comes from?
Well, I think it comes from our capacity to reason. I think you want me to stop there?
Yeah, I want you to stop there because I want to get to reason in a second. But since we're talking about reason, first let's dispense with religion. Clearly, if ethics are the result in one way or another of evolution, it's not suddenly the savages were endowed with an intellect and suddenly given a universal ethics. And you wrote, and this argument has been given in a number of ways, but I like the way you wrote it. We can dispense with God in one paragraph, so I want to read what you wrote. One reason why religion no longer provides a satisfactory answer to the puzzle about the nature of morality is that religious belief itself is no longer as universally accepted as it once was. But there's another problem in locating the origin of morality in the will of God. If all values result from God's will, what reason could God have for willing as he does? If killing is wrong only because God had said, "Thou shalt not kill," then God might have just as easily have said, "Thou shalt kill." Would killing them then have been right? To agree with that it would have been right makes morality too arbitrary. But to deny that it would have been right is to assume that there are standards of right and wrong independent of God's will. Nor can the dilemma be avoided by claiming that God is good and so could not have willed us to kill unjustly, for to say that God is good already implies a standard of goodness that is independent of God's decision. And as Steve Pinker's put it, ultimately, just let's get rid of the middleman. So evolution has really told us that ethics evolves,
yes,
and is not given in a universal sense, independent of reason. We'll talk about reason.
I think that's right. Ethics has evolved, but let's just be clear. That doesn't mean that the ethic that has evolved is necessarily the right ethic, right? That's another step to say what we ought to do. And if you just say, well, we've evolved to have this nature, it doesn't follow that that is what we ought to do.
Yeah, we'll get to that. In fact, what we ought to do is often quite different from what we've evolved within the nature. But it's hard to know, and one of the reasons I think that science gives us ethics is it's hard to know whether those things we get from nature are right or wrong without knowing that we get them from nature in the first place to be able to...
Absolutely. It's important to know what we do get, what can be explained in evolutionary terms, because then we can look at it critically and say, well, we now know how this has arisen, why we have these kinds of responses, but are they really, maybe there's something that helped our ancestors to survive, but are they really responses that we want to have in the world today?
Well, okay, so now you are strongly described the importance of scientific results for evolving our views of ourselves and the appropriate ethics that we might want to develop. But you strongly argue that, of course, science is limited. And one of the arguments you have in one of your books, which I like, is you say, the reason many philosophers don't take any notice of genetics or evolutionary theory is that because the important philosophical questions, like what is good, have to be answered before we can use information about the consequences of our actions to decide what we ought to do. Now, I find that hard to take because how do you know what's good? I mean, what is good? If you don't have any experience, if there's no experiential phenomena at all, what does good mean?
Oh, I think if we didn't have any experiences, we couldn't be here discussing it, right? We have to have experiences, and then we have to make judgments, but we can still there are still a variety of different ethical views, right? There might be views that just say, well, having the best experiences, the most pleasurable experiences, the greatest happiness, that's the standard utilitarian view, to which, in fact, I'm very sympathetic, but I don't think you can deduce that from the fact that we have experiences. And even if you did, there's questions of distribution.
So what's good? I mean, what's good?
So, I mean, that's what is good is what we are judging to be the best outcome, right?
But judging the best outcome.
Yeah.
But then you only know what's good after you know the outcomes and the consequences of your experiences. So it seems to me goodness comes after rather than before.
I'm not quite sure that I'm following
what
you mean by
say
that. But
we have to know what is good. It has to be answered before we can use information about the consequences of our actions.
Yeah, before
to decide what we ought to
it.
do. But it seems to me
Right.
you need to know about the consequences before you can decide what's good.
You do need to know what the consequences are, but you still have that decision. So it might be, for example, that when you find out what the consequences are, you will say, well, look, we can make most people happier, but we have to treat some people very badly in order to make most people happier. Now, some people might say, well, let's just go with the majority. Some people might say, no, there's an injustice here, or you're not respecting some people, or you're violating their rights. And they would want to say, therefore, it's not good to go ahead with this course of conduct.
Okay, so let's follow from there then, because I know we jumped ahead and we mentioned the word reason, and we might as well get back to it now, because, and I agree with you that I think to the extent that ethics are universal and time invariant, to the extent if that's really true, it's by the use of reason. But if that's the case, it seems to me that science does determine ethics. Because and we talked about this earlier today, but I maybe have a too expansive view of science, but to me, science is two things. It's taking experiential data, making predictions, which we can then test, and then using logical arguments to infer consequences of those theories that are now valid. But it seems to me that's exactly, so science goes all the way through to ultimately determining what's correct ethically, because it gives us predictions about what the consequences of our actions are, and then we make logical deductions based on that about the best way of acting. So science takes you all the way through. And evolution, we have to, as you say, we have to recognize that some of the actions we take are influenced purely by our evolutionary background, and we have to be willing to overcome them. And as you say, we have to use reason to overcome nature.
Yeah, but it's the term logical deduction that I'm objecting to. So I think it's very important to have all this data to understand how we form these judgments, also to understand what the consequences of our actions are likely to be. But I still don't think there is a logical deduction that tells you, once you've done that, for example, that you ought to maximize the sum total of happiness rather than you ought to make sure that no injustice is done to a minority or something of that sort.
Yeah, I mean, this argument goes up, of course, back to Hume, or maybe before, the idea that you can't get ought from is.
Yeah, Hume was the one who formulated it very clearly, that's right, and I still think he's right.
Well, but let's go further then. Is there you can come to different conclusions, but you would argue that reason will ultimately take you to the appropriate conclusion.
This is my hope, right? Not all philosophers think this, but I do think that reasoning is the way to find the right moral standards.
Okay, well, but isn't that then just an application of the scientific method? Right. You can say, look, if I do this, then certain people will be happy, other people will be unhappy. If I do this, I maximize another thing. Yeah. But then I'll use logic and inference about looking at society to say the logical conclusion is that path A is the correct way and not path B. Well, and therefore, and in principle, if there is an ultimate ethics that is right rather than just preferred, then science takes you all the way there.
I mean, if you want to use science in this expanded sense that includes the operation of our reason, even where it's not a formal logical deduction from the data, then I don't mind. And certainly, 19th century writers talked about the science of ethics.
Yeah.
If you use the German term Wissenschaft, then Germans would regard that as including ethics, for example, as a science, as a scholarly activity, an activity open to reason. I'm very happy with that broader account. It's just the deduction from the facts that I'm objecting to.
Well, we also talked about this idea earlier, and again, I'm just a physicist, so I argued to you that I don't think there's any kind of truth except for experiential truth, except for truth based on evidence. And maybe we could, I know we were talking about that.
Yeah, right.
And
so the one obvious counterexample is mathematical truth. I mean, I don't think we conclude from looking at one glass and a second glass that there's two glasses, and then we try that again and there's still two glasses, and we keep trying.
No, but don't
I
we
think
really?
That's something we know.
Again, people always confront me with mathematical truths, but mathematical truths seem to me to be empirical, because ultimately they're subject to testing. In this case, you make a proposition and you test to see if this system, which is highly constrained, not constrained by what you want, but by the internal logic of the system, if the prediction based on that is validated, if the proof proves out to be wrong. And then, and again, because I'm a physicist and not a mathematician, what we really care about mathematics, it's beautiful on its own, there's no doubt about it, but we really care about it is as a model of the world. And then we check. If I have 2 cups here, and I put 2 more cups here, and I say, there are 4 cups, that mathematical model works. So it seems to me that the mathematical truths that are relevant to the world are really empirical.
But it's not experimental, right? It's not like any experiment could refute the idea that if you add
Well, I could
two
put them out
objects,
there, and I put 2 more cups in for only 3, then it refutes it.
Then we'd say, there's some trickster, there's some magician here. We'd start looking under the table or whatever, right?
No, but that's an experiment, don't you think?
I don't know.
I'm a theorist, so my experiments are pretty simple.
What about logical truths, right? What about the idea, we have the hypothetical syllogism, if P then Q, P therefore Q, or if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P.
Well, again, it seems to me to some extent, you're right, they're logical, but it's as I say, you examine them within the context of a system that you can't control and make predictions based on those logical syllogisms to see whether the results are appropriate. And if they're not, then there's something wrong with the logic. So again, it always seems to me you're coming back to some check. And to me, science is just constantly checking.
To me, it's normative. It's rather like if somebody didn't follow that syllogism and refused to draw the conclusion that, yes, I accept P, I accept if P then Q, but I just don't accept Q, they're making some kind of mistake that is not just empirical.
Okay, well, that's interesting, because then, they're making a mistake. Okay, what does that mean? I don't mean to put you in the hot seat. Well, I'm going to be much more sympathetic.
So they're being irrational. You could say that, right? I mean, they're not reasoning correctly.
And what does that mean?
Well, it's in a way, it's a fundamental law of reason that the formal logical truths
work.
Well,
that's the only reason we care about science, because it works.
But look, I would want to say that any other rational being, suppose we came across aliens in another galaxy, any other, and they're rational beings, so we can communicate, they would also know these laws so we would be able to agree with them, even though they might have very different natures, they might have different forms of perception, they might.
So they'd know the laws, just like they'd have derived general relativity or Newtonian mechanics or electromagnetism. So their science would have resulted in the same laws as our science, don't you think?
Well, I think they wouldn't. They may or may not have done those experiments that led to those theories.
Okay, I raised the point. And by the way, I meant to say you all have question cards, and you should be thinking of really good questions, and not like the questions I'm asking. And then pass them down, and during the intermission, we'll go through and filter them, and we'll
filter out the ones that are difficult for him.
I'll filter the ones I like, or the ones I agree with. No, we'll try and get it. So please be thinking of questions in this regard. But so this is an issue that I think is an interesting one to me, because I do think actually science can, in some sense, determine ethics. But another key point that you really said is, what if I choose not to behave appropriately? And this is a question of choice, which you've also talked about.
Yeah.
But that assumes, at least apparently, it assumes free will. So I want to spend 2 minutes on free will, which is all I think it's worth.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we may agree on this. It assumes free will in the sense that we have this sense that we have to choose, right? That if I could now choose, for example, to drink your glass of water rather than mine, and that's open to me. Now, somebody might predict that, oh, he's got such a phobia of other people's germs, he'll never do that. But I have this sense that I could choose to do that. So even if somebody could predict that I won't, I still have to make that decision. And when we come to more difficult ethical choices, we're aware that we have to make that decision. You know, we're going to talk about things like whether you ought to eat meat or whether you ought to donate to charities that are helping the global poor. You have to make that choice, right? You'll either do it or you won't do it. The fact that somebody might, in theory, be able to predict your choice if they knew, you know, the position of every electron in the universe or a lot of other theories, that's not going to enable you to avoid the choice. And that's the sense in which we have free will that's important to ethics.
Yeah, I mean, here's an area I agree, I think, very much with you. There's a lot of talk about free will, but it doesn't really matter. As a physicist, it's pretty clear to me there's no such thing as free will. Which may sound funny, because people often use quantum mechanics as an argument for not having free will, because quantum mechanics is probabilistic. But it's not. It's a deterministic theory. At a fundamental level, what's called the wave function, which is the primary thing in quantum mechanics, is completely determined by a second-order differential equation. You know the initial conditions, you know it afterwards. The measurements of it are probabilistic. So at some level, the universe is deterministic. And there is no such thing as free will, except for all intents and purposes, because the world is complicated, it's indistinguishable from a world in which there looks like there's free will. Just like you feel like you're making that choice, whether or not you actually were determined to make that choice, you're taking an action, and the experience of choosing it is something you feel to be real. And whether or not at a fundamental level it was determined is irrelevant, because there's so many variables that will never really likely be able to determine every action you take. And so, therefore, even though there isn't choice, there's the illusion of choice.
Well, you could call it an illusion. I mean, I think I'm prepared to agree with you that at a fundamental level of particle physics, the universe is determined. Whether you say, therefore, choice is an illusion...
well, maybe it's a little too strong, I think.
Yeah,
but
right.
The point is that we make choices, we feel like we have choices, and we need to live as if we have choices. I think that's the point.
And what we do makes a difference, right? I mean, this pen is now on the floor because I chose to pick it up as an example and put it on the floor.
Exactly.
So you know, that came through me.
And it doesn't evade from responsibility. Some people seem to think that in a world without free will, there's no responsibility.
Yes, no. And in fact, you know, what you said about quantum physics, I think that would be a hopeless direction for responsibility, because you wouldn't want your responsibility to depend on the apparently random directions in which particles fire, right?
Well, but you know, you did that. If that pen had dropped on my foot and hurt it, you'd be responsible for it.
I would.
But it wouldn't.
It's a very light pen.
But it's unlikely, because this is really a plastic shoe, and it'll protect me.
By the way,
a lot more than a leather shoe.
Since I heard that introduction, I wasn't there. I think my non-leather shoes are actually more stylish than yours. But
yeah, that's right.
We won't get into that.
Well, it's probably true, but I always feel one should defer to one's guests. So I found what
you can order these from Moo Shoes, by the way, if you want to go online.
Absolutely. And my leather belt is not leather either. So there we go. There's nothing on me that was anyway. What was I going to talk about? Oh yeah, free will. So the fact is, one does make choices, and whether they're determined or not, if you kill someone, or if you hurt someone, you're responsible for that. Whether or not, in some sense, you have control, it may affect what decisions we make regarding punishment, but it doesn't change the fact of people being responsible. Do you agree with that?
Yes, that's right. I do think it's relevant to punishment, in that I think you could say that, you know, some people think there's this deep sense of desert, that people deserve to suffer if they've done bad things. I mean, my view of punishment is a kind of necessary thing for society, that there has to be some consequences when people do bad things to deter them, to prevent them doing further bad things, hopefully to reform them, although we don't unfortunately seem to have a system of punishment that works well in that direction. But not because, you know, somehow they deserve to suffer in this deeper way.
And in fact, we can use that. The fact that people can change their minds they still may have no choice, but there are a lot of variables, including things you experience or things you're taught, that will determine your decisions. And that can actually make people behave in a way that may be more ethical.
Yes, that's right. And it may be a lot easier for people to be ethical if they're in certain social circumstances than in others, really.
Now, okay, I want to jump ahead because I want to move to some other areas. But I want to get to what I think is at the heart of everything you've written, that at least I've read, which is really the fundamental ethics based on reason, which is that, taking what you'd call an objective point of view involves seeing our own interests as no more important than the like interests of anyone else. That sort of summarizes it. And I was pleased to see that you referred, going back to philosophers, to William Godwin, who's, for my friends will know, his wife is the feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, who I'm very interested in of late. And he said, what magic is there in the pronoun my that should justify us in overturning the decisions of impartial justice. Impartial justice. Yeah. So I think, do you agree that basically if I look at your philosophy from animal liberation, which we'll get to doing good, to saving lives, it's basically this idea that one needs to take an attitude that your interests are no more important than anyone else's. And that comes from reason?
I think so. I think reason allows us to take this point of view. I have a co-authored book called The Point of View of the Universe, which is a phrase from the 19th century philosopher Henry Sidgwick. And if we were not beings capable of reasoning, we couldn't take this point of view. We would kind of be locked in our own perspective, and we would be responding to our own emotions and feelings and desires. But the capacity to reason enables us to actually see that there are other people in the world, and other non-human animals as well, that also have interests, and that we can imagine what it's like to be those people when those interests have been thwarted. Okay,
and in fact, you agree in that sense with Steve Pinker, who's been here, his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, that somehow enlightenment and reason has actually made the world a better, less violent place, no matter what it seems like today.
Absolutely, and Steven Pinker in that book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, is kind enough to cite my own earlier book, The Expanding Circle, which I think you were quoting from earlier on, which has the germ of that idea, but Steven Pinker has done it much better in that he's done a lot of research to really back it up and show that this has been a process where, it's very easy to think if you look at the headlines on newspapers and TV that the world is getting worse and worse, but that's a myth. If you compare rates of violence, the chances of anyone born today dying a violent death at the hands of your fellow humans are lower than at any previous point in history. And that, Pinker argues, is due to a process of reasoning that perhaps began with the printing press and then through the Enlightenment.
Through science, in fact, wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely, through science as well.
Yeah, so essentially science has brought us to this you get the point. But seriously, in a sense that you talk about the fact that we can empathize, that we understand we're no more special than anyone else, but that comes from the realization, which after all came from science, that there are no fundamental differences between color or there are differences, but not ones of hierarchical differences between color or sex, and that allows us to empathize, and now with animals.
Right.
And that wouldn't have been possible without science. So it's really brought us to that, to what is ethics, and therefore,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can understand more about what it's like to be a different being in the world than we possibly could have without what science has shown us.
Now, there's two things I want to do before I switch subjects. One is the golden rule, which sounds like it's the same thing in some sense, but it was actually my wife who is always enlightens me. Who the golden rule isn't good. I had never thought of it before.
How are you going to state it is the question, right?
Yeah, that's really, as it's stated, it's clearly wrong. It's just do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But that's not what you want to do. It's really, you want to do unto others as they would have you do unto them. I mean, say you like to be spanked, okay? I don't have to go any further, do I?
Okay. Yes, right, absolutely. So it's really, what it should be is, as you would want them to do to you if you had their set of preferences, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You have to take on their preference.
Yeah, it's not your preference. It's not
right.
what you want done.
That is true.
You really want to do it. And so it's always stated incorrectly, including in that book that I don't want to refer to.
Well, you know, I mean, it was written a long time ago. It wasn't a bad attempt.
Yeah, it was written by Iron Age peasants. They didn't know. They weren't.
Yeah,
They couldn't have had the discussion we're having now. Okay. But let me just add one. So we're all agreeing about reason, except, and who was it that said reason is the slave of passion?
David Hume.
Again, David Hume again. He's always getting in the way. But there's a better quote that I like from Oscar Wilde.
That's a quote of Hume I don't accept, by the way, whereas I did accept the one about you can't deduce.
Yeah, I think but we have to worry, nevertheless, and I think you do a great job in the Expanding Circle talking about the fact that we do have to worry when we make what we think are rational decisions about whether we're really making them on reason and passion. And there have been a lot, as you actually, I think in an appendix or an update of the book, you point out Jonathan Haidt and other research. It shows a lot of the decisions we make that we think are rational are really based on sort of snap judgments or things we wanted to believe in beforehand. So we have to really second guess ourselves, which is something, you know, you have to in science.
And that's another area where science helps us to understand ethics and to do a better job of getting to the right ethics.
Yeah.
Because what Jonathan Haidt has shown is that we have these kind of innate yuck reactions, and then we sort of, where they don't fit the facts, we sort of make up stories to explain why we think something is wrong. So there's this famous story that he tells people about two adults who are alone, a man and a woman who are alone in a cabin at night, and they decide to have sex. Now, you might think, you know, there's nothing wrong with that for that story, but if I tell you that they're brother and sister, then you might think, oh. If I tell you that they used contraception so that there was no chance that they would have a child who might be abnormal, you know, but I still ask you, you know, what do you think of that? Most people will still say, no, that was wrong.
Yeah.
And then when you ask them why, a lot of people will say, well, they might have had a child who would have been abnormal, right? So they've sort of forgotten or blotted out this fact.
Because because it's a biological and social taboo, it's built into us.
That's right. So we have this taboo. I think it's probably biological because there were evolutionary reasons for not having sex between close relatives. But it's interesting now that that taboo still survives as a kind of yuck reaction. Yeah. Although it's certainly at least possible to.
No, I think it's a great example. I used it, and in fact, I've been labeled now online because I used it in a debate with an Islamic individual about the fact that you've got to ask yourself the question: what science really does, for me, is it takes us out of our myopic picture that the universe must be the way we think it is, and that what we think is sensible is really sensible, and that what we like is universal. And so this example is wonderful because it forces us to say, well, if I really think about it, you know, are these universal laws that are written down in your sacred book really universal? And is there really anything wrong with incest if two knowing adults do it and there's no power struggle, there's no production of children, and it really forces you to rethink.
It makes you ask these questions, and it shows that even if they are universal, that might be because of our common evolutionary heritage, and that in itself, at least, doesn't show that there's something wrong. I'm not saying whether there is or isn't anything wrong, but it's not enough just to rely on the yuck reaction. Yeah,
and so I don't get more letters, I wouldn't recommend it, but I wouldn't necessarily.
I'm not either.
I wouldn't necessarily argue that there's something fundamentally wrong with the notion of it, and I think that, you know, there's a quote that you give, which I think ultimately we have to always be suspicious of our reason. That's before we leave. That's all I wanted to say is that reason may drive us there, but there may be many reasons for getting there. And there's a great quote from Oscar Wilde, which I love, which is, "Man is a rational animal who always loses his temper when he's called upon to act in accordance with the dictates of reason."
That could be a kind of commentary on my career, I think. I've had a lot of opposition for, I think, because people are good at finding justifications for not doing what I think
but ultimately, in the end, in spite of the fact that we sort of came from the beginning by saying there are no, you know, at least there are no universal laws handed down of ethics, ultimately there are, you would say, and that anyone in any galaxy in the universe would come to those same conclusions because of reason. And so you end that book by basically saying in fact, I think I have it here at the end of the book, the last few sentences of the book, which really quite impressed me with what you said so strongly, which I don't have here. But anyway, here we go. That the existence of objective moral truths allows us to hope that we may be able to distinguish these intuitive responses from the reason for action that all rational sentient beings would have, even rational sentient beings who had evolved in circumstances very different than our own. So that's a hope.
Yes, that is a hope that, we're certainly not there yet, but that we can sort through with our intuitions which are the ones that have reasons behind them that justify them and which are the ones that don't, and we can get rid of the ones that don't.
Okay, so that idea which is based on reason, which ultimately comes back to the fact that your interests are no more important in a cosmic sense than anyone else's, and you have to take that into account, means ultimately that you take this notion of altruism and extend it not just from kin to group to society to humanity, but to animals. And that was the, let's have a round of applause if you want to have that. But,
thank you.
But, and that was the central premise of animal liberation, which changed the world in many. We'll see how much it changed the world, but it certainly changed the world for some people. And in fact, you say the core of the book is to claim that to discriminate against beings solely on account of their species is a form of prejudice, immoral and indefensible, in the same way that discrimination on the basis of race is immoral and indefensible. And that is a profoundly important idea that hasn't been with us for very long. But I couldn't resist. You called it animal liberation. I don't know if you were influenced by that wonderful woman, Mary Wollstonecraft again, who was a feminist, but wrote a book called Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, and was attacked by saying, there was a vindication of the rights of brutes, animals. Namely, if you vindicate the rights of women, you might as well vindicate the rights of animals.
That's right. It was a kind of a parody, I think. May have been a parody that was trying to show that, this is the next logical step. And of course, that is in a way the nature of the argument that I'm putting, that we have advanced in our notions of human rights. So we had in 1975, when I wrote the book, we had advanced that where we now hold, even if we don't fully live up to it, of course, but we now hold that human rights extend to all members of our species, that there's a kind of basic moral equality of all human beings, and we think that having got to that point, we've now gone as far as we should go. But my argument was that that's a mistake. This is, getting rid of boundaries of race or sex are not the last boundaries. That there are still other beings in the world whose lives can go well or badly, who can suffer or enjoy their lives, and therefore we have to include them in the sphere of morality as well. We can't ignore their interests, and so that's the analogy with extending the circle of ethics further.
But there are a lot of things here that again are subtle. That equal consideration does not mean equal treatment. I think that's an important distinction that you make. That equal consideration of different species, different beings. I think you put equal consideration for different beings may lead to different treatment and different rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, clearly that is true with humans as well. We don't think that small children have the same rights as adults, even though we do think that in some sense they're equal and we ought to give equal consideration to their interests. And the same is true for animals. It would be just as absurd to give non-human animals a right to vote as it would be to give 2-year-olds a right to vote.
Or Republicans.
Aren't we in Arizona here?
Yeah, we're in Arizona. That's why I said it.
This is not a representative sample of Arizonan voters.
No, this is not. But there are at least 3,000 people in Arizona who should be allowed to vote, and they come to our events. So, But what you do say is, in some sense, what really determines this, and the capuchin monkeys, which come back again, for two reasons. One is because you see there that they have the capacity, not just for physical suffering, but in some sense, mental anguish. And I think you say, the capacity for suffering and enjoyment is a prerequisite for having interests at all, a condition that must be satisfied before we can speak of interest in a meaningful way. It's really the capacity to suffer and enjoy that really, in some sense, determines the rights that we have to give animals.
Yes, the ones we have to include. And that's why, I wasn't harming the pen when I dropped it on the floor.
Yeah.
But if I had done that to some animal, I might have harmed it. So it is that capacity to suffer or enjoy your life that I think is the ultimate boundary. I don't believe, I know some people will talk about rights of plants or trees or streams or mountains. I mean, I think that that's a kind of metaphorical way of talking about the importance of preserving nature. I don't think that they directly have interests in the way that any being who can suffer has interests.
Okay, now, but there's another aspect of that video, which was, and some of my staff actually didn't want me to show the video because it disturbed them. It's kind of funny video, and as I say, every time I get jealous of someone, I think of that and say, maybe I don't have to be that way. But they're in cages. So at the same time, we've got this ethical issue. There's something useful that came from it, but are we treating them appropriately?
Well, I mean, they're in those cages by themselves for the purpose of that experiment. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that they would be in those cages all the time. I think Frans de Waal is very aware that they're social animals and would release them to a much larger enclosure where they're in a group when they're not participating in that research. You could still object to it in some ways, but I think to object to that when there's so many worse things going on that we do to animals, both in research and in other areas of life, that that would not be the one that I would pick on to campaign against.
Well, that's a perfect segue. I couldn't have. That's where I was hoping you'd go, because I want you to spend some time. One of the most, the whole book is compelling, animal liberation, in my opinion. But what I particularly like about it is it's based on data, mm-hmm. and not just talk. And one of the things that's so damning is your discussion in great detail of how we treat animals for food. And also how we treat animals for testing. But I think that we don't have enough time to go on both. But I just thought maybe because the real facts of how, of the pastoral idea of animals being farmed and used is not really true in factory farming. So maybe you could give one or two examples, because I think it's important to get them out.
Absolutely, and I think the farming area is the one to choose, both because it's vastly larger, something like 9 billion animals raised and killed for food each year in the United States. Plus, it's the one that you can all do something about quite directly in terms of not supporting it with your consumer spending. So let's just take some examples. One of the largest number of these animals are chickens, and people think chickens are stupid and so on. But in fact, chickens are also social beings, and they can show that they are quite aware of various things, and they can suffer in various ways. And a lot of people say to me, when I talk about being a vegetarian or a vegan, they say, I don't eat red meat. Well, I think in terms of animal suffering, eating chicken is the worst thing to do, because 99.9% of the chickens produced in the United States are factory farmed. That is, they lead their lives inside vast sheds that might hold 20,000 birds. They're crowded together so that if you look at one of these sheds when they're getting ready to be killed, it's just like a carpet of white feathers. They are bred to grow extremely fast. They're killed at 6 weeks, 42 days of age. They're basically babies, but they're very large babies. And they're bred to grow so fast that quite often their legs will collapse under them. Their immature leg bones can't hold the weight. Now, there's no individual attention for these birds. You've got 20,000 birds in a shed. Nobody is going to notice that this bird can't walk, that it's just sitting on the litter. So what will happen to it? It can't get up and walk over to where the water is or where the food is. So it's going to starve to death or die of thirst. And that, because there's such a vast industry, billions of birds, we're talking about hundreds of millions of chickens in the United States that die of thirst or hunger each year. And, you know, even if they don't, there's the crowding. The air is full of ammonia. If you walk into one of these sheds, you know, it really gets in your eyes immediately. And then they're just rounded up in the, you know, quickest possible way because they're so cheap. And they're trucked. You might have seen the trucks, how they're crammed. They're trucked to slaughter. They're not all pre-stunned because, again, there's so much pressure on doing it so fast that some of them will miss the stunner and have their throats cut while they're fully conscious. So it's really a disgusting business, I think. And, you know, anybody with any concern for animal suffering ought not to be supporting it.
I mean, that's, yeah. You know, I don't really think that was disgusting enough, so let's go a little more. Because we talked about an example this afternoon that was really about a related bird, since it's coming up for Thanksgiving, which you're all going to enjoy. Let's talk turkey.
Yeah. So turkeys are also factory farmed in large sheds in pretty similar sorts of conditions. But there's one particular peculiarity that a lot of Americans don't know about when they're thinking about their Thanksgiving turkey. And that is that the standard factory farm turkey, which again is 99% of all the turkeys sold in America, has been bred to have a breast so large that it cannot mate. The male actually just physically cannot get it into the female. So how is it that there are more turkeys of these breeds? Because there are unfortunate workers whose sole job it is all day is to masturbate male turkeys and collect the semen, and other workers whose job it is to grab the female turkeys and inject the semen into them. I have a friend and colleague, Jim Mason, with whom I wrote a book called The Ethics of What We Eat. And so that he could really speak about this experience firsthand, he applied for a job as a turkey inseminator. He lasted one day in that job. He said it was the worst, filthiest, hardest day's work he ever did. And he was at the bottom of the pecking order. Everybody was taking it out on him for not working fast enough, which meant he had to grab the turkeys faster, be rough to them. These turkeys, especially the females, know what's going to happen and they don't like it, so they're struggling. He's grabbing them, trying to inseminate them, and if he doesn't do it fast enough, he gets kicked and abused by the people above him. So, of course, you know, not Jim, but most of the workers at the bottom of that pecking order will take it out on the birds as well. So, you know, think about that before you order your Thanksgiving turkey. Again, do you really want to participate in this practice, which is created just so that Americans can eat more turkey breast meat?
Yeah, I mean, you're very strong. I mean, the point is, you say this is undeniably immoral, and the moral obligation.
Because you know we're going against the greatest interest of these animals in not suffering and having a reasonable life, just so that we can have a somewhat cheaper product.
And you know, I think you say until we boycott meat and all other products of animal factories, we are, each one of us, contributing to the continued existence, prosperity, and growth of factory farming and all other cruel practices in rearing animals for food, and that's immoral. Therefore, you argue in favor of vegetarianism, clearly.
Indeed,
and strongly so. And you know, by the way, I should tell my staff and all of you that we're going long. Okay, we're going long because I'm enjoying myself. Okay, because you have a lot to say. So I hope you don't mind if I give them a little extra time to say it. Anyone object? Good. If you object, anyway. But you know, there's an argument, what I think is almost more powerful as an argument for vegetarianism is not the cruelty we do to animals. And I was going to talk about free-range farming and things like that, but maybe I won't. It's the problem, well, there's two problems, is that really it's a reflection of a problem of ourselves. That the main reason to be a vegetarian is not just for the animals, but for humans. Because the production of the kind of food that we eat is destroying the environment for humans. So maybe you could talk about since we've just come out of the year of the Anthropocene in the Origins project, the fact that really what we're doing is hurting ourselves in the process.
We are. I mean, I don't know whether it's, you know, which of the more important ones of these reasons. They're all important. But the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization said a few years ago that livestock raising produces more greenhouse gases than the entire transport sector, than all of the cars, all of the trucks, all of the planes, all of the ships and trains, everything that moves, that uses fossil fuel. That's less than the greenhouse gas emissions of the livestock industry. So, that is something that we could stop in a way more easily than we can stop the transport or the generation of electricity, which is more difficult for us to live without. But by moving to a plant-based diet, and here it's worth saying it's not just vegetarian, because the dairy industry, cattle, are big producers of methane. So whether they're dairy or beef, they're producing a lot of methane. Moving to a vegan diet will greatly reduce your greenhouse gas footprint. It's been calculated that the difference between driving a standard American vehicle and shifting to a hybrid like a Prius is actually less in terms of reducing your carbon footprint than between moving from the standard American diet to a vegan diet. That'll make a bigger difference to reduce your footprint. And there's lots of other environmental effects. If we had time, we could go into the pollution of the rivers that's come from factory farming, the way in which antibiotics have been used in ways that are very dangerous because they lose their efficacy because they're routinely prescribed in many factory farm conditions.
Yeah. I mean, I think you say, I hope anyone who's read this far will recognize the moral necessity of refusing to buy or eat the flesh of other products of animals who have been reared in modern factory farm conditions. This is the clearest case of all, the absolute minimum that anyone with the capacity to look beyond considerations of narrow self-interest should come to accept, and in fact argue very strongly that we need to do this for ourselves as well as everyone else. Now, so that moral obligation is there. You presented very clearly in 1975. It was a while ago. Do you see a change? And do you take credit for it?
I do see a change. There's a huge number of people who should take credit for it. I might be one of them, but all of those people who've founded, joined, supported all of the animal organizations, animal rights groups, animal groups that are fighting for animals, in this country, in many other countries around the world, they've done a great job. And they have brought about change. In Europe, for example, in the entire European Union, 28 nations from Greece to England, from Portugal to Poland, the standard battery cage, the conditions in which eggs are produced in these standard, very crowded wire cages, has been banned. The confinement of breeding sows in stalls so narrow that they can't turn around, that's been banned. These are big changes that affect hundreds of millions of animals. And we've started to see them in this country as well. California banned them as a result of a voters' initiative in 2008 that got very strong support. More support, got a higher vote than Barack Obama did. And California obviously was an easy win for Obama. But the initiative to give all farm animals room to turn around without touching other animals or the sides of their enclosure got a higher vote. And that legislation was phased in over, I think, 7 years, and so it's come into effect now. And we're seeing also pressure on corporations that are starting to change. Just last month, McDonald's said that they would phase out the use of eggs from caged hens within the next 10 years. McDonald's is the biggest single consumer of eggs in the United States. 4% of all eggs produced in the United States go through McDonald's. So that's a big difference. And if McDonald's feels it has to make this move, it's a sign that consumer opinion has shifted, and I think it means the battery cage for hens is on the way out.
And you even said that, I mean, if McDonald's can move, that maybe even the church could move, and that
Yeah, I think you probably saw that Pope Francis issued an encyclical earlier this year, which got headlines because of his strong stance on climate change, acknowledging that climate change is real and saying that as stewards of the planet, we ought to do something about it. But even more remarkable to me is that there are statements about animals which reverse the views taken by the greatest of the Roman Catholic philosophers, Thomas Aquinas.
Hold on a second. That's an oxymoron. Great Catholic philosopher, isn't it?
Well,
Okay.
the greatest of the Catholic thinkers who was constrained within the Catholic tradition. Of course, he did have this problem of trying to have to not contradict Catholic faith because he was living in the 13th century in Europe. But, you know, he did as well as he could, maybe you might say, within that constraint. Anyway, but he did say on animals, he said, God has given us dominion over the animals, and that means that nothing that we do to animals is a sin because of what we do to animals. If it's a sin, it would only be a sin because it has some bad effects on humans. You can be as cruel as you like to the animal. If it has no bad effects for humans, there's nothing wrong with it. And Pope Francis just this year, after, what is this, like 700 years after Thomas Aquinas, said, no, that's not the way to interpret the verse in Genesis, which says that God gave us dominion over the animals. We have to have some concern for them as well. He even went so far as to say that we shouldn't kill them unnecessarily. I'm waiting for him to become a vegetarian because obviously killing them for meat is unnecessary if, like the Pope or like us here, we can walk into a supermarket and buy a good range of healthy, nutritionally adequate, non-meat products.
And, you know, there's so much more I'd like to do there, but I want to change subjects. I mean, the point is, it's the unnecessariness act, because the standard argument that's given, which I gave at some point, I guess, and I think you probably convinced me out of it when I was reading, is that, you know, this is natural. Animals eat other animals, and you know, it's okay to do it, and in a natural sense. But your point is, to kill, to not starve is one thing, but to kill when there are alternatives is another.
Exactly. We have choices. People always bring out, you know, what about the Inuits? How would they live if they didn't kill? Well, okay, but unless you're an Inuit living a traditional Inuit lifestyle, then that doesn't apply to you.
Exactly. Okay, so I want to move from saving animals to saving lives, and you wrote a book called The Life You Can Save, and there I learned that not only are our actions bad, but our inactions are worse, and it's a compelling description of the life of poverty of what 1.4 billion people who live under.
It's actually, fortunately, it's down now, right? That book was published in 2009, so it was written in 2008, and the number of people in extreme poverty, as defined by the World Bank, has actually dropped quite dramatically in those 6 or 7 years. So it's well below 1 billion now, but it's still significant, obviously.
And why don't you talk about what the poverty level is? Because it's staggering what's defined worldwide as what the poverty level is.
Okay. So the World Bank's level for extreme poverty is income of $1.25 US per day. But that is the purchasing power equivalent. So if you're thinking to yourself, oh, I've traveled in some developing countries, and when I take my US dollars to the bank and they give me the local currency, it's amazing how far that will go. Yeah. You know, I can buy a meal for 30 cents. I can sleep somewhere for a couple of dollars. So you think, so maybe it's not that difficult. But this is already adjusted for that. It's not the official foreign currency exchange rate, it's the purchasing power equivalent. So it's what purchases as much as $1.25 does. Now, admittedly, that's inflation, needs to be inflation adjusted because that goes back a few years. But, you know, if you said $1.75, you'd be pretty much right. So think about what we'll buy in these countries that much, and think about trying to live on that. And the flip side of that is think about how little that means to us, and therefore how relatively easy it is for us to make a significant difference to the lives of people who are living on so little, on you know, $500, $600 a year.
And so basically the argument is that, and we talked about this earlier today, and you was sort of something which I thought was rather interesting, that I've wondered whether we could, this has been a time-invariant problem that could always be solved. There was always sufficient wealth in some sense to ameliorate poverty. And some people say poverty's always been there, poverty always will be there. The argument is we can't do anything about it. But you've argued that really there's something specifically different about the present time.
There is, because we live in a world in which, firstly, the proportion of people in poverty has shrunk. It used to be that, you know, most of the world's population was in poverty at some point. If you go back even just to 1980, on the World Bank figures, I think it was 43% of the world living in poverty. Now we're getting close to down to 10%, not quite there, but the predictions are perhaps by the end of the year or next year we'll be down to just 10%, about 700 and something million people in extreme poverty. So that's shrunk. On the other side, the number of people who are living in real affluence is quite large. It's well over 1 billion. And this is a kind of affluence that just hasn't existed before, right? We have all these things that nobody had before. The ability to travel around the world, to eat fresh fruit in winter, to warm ourselves when it's cold and cool ourselves when it's hot. So we have resources, and we also have the technology to get what is needed to people in need. So I think we have opportunities to really dramatically reduce poverty that we never had before.
And you pointed out that that basically by not buying bottled water or a coffee, so most people can accept that. But there's a line in here that I think is rather interesting. You say, is it possible that by choosing to spend your money on such things as clothing, movies, concerts, vacations, new cars, you're leaving a child to die? So that basically spending money on concerts, fashionable shoes, museums are wrong.
I shouldn't have boasted about my shoes, should I?
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I think it's true that what we spend on ourselves, we don't have to donate to effective charities. At the same time, I'm not asking everybody to be completely saintly and walk around in sackcloth, right?
But the point is that there's a lot of things we could do. So the question I want to ask you is, did the people who came here tonight to spend money on us do something wrong?
Definitely not. No, they're educating themselves. Education is a really important value, and trying to understand about the world and about ethics and what we can do in it, I hope that there's going to be a clear gain for charities.
But I wasn't being facetious. It was a good chance for a laugh line. But more than, it's really true that when people go to museums or go to other things, ultimately, you don't know the consequences of all your actions. So ultimately, the learning experience you have by taking a child to a museum, which will have them appreciate the world better, may ultimately do more to alleviate poverty than having spent the $3 or whatever, $10 to help a child. It's a subtle question, and there are many things you can do that ultimately may do more than just giving money.
Yes, I think that's true. There are definitely, as you say, you don't know the consequences of everything you do. Education is clearly an important value, and it's partly because we are better educated that we're also more prosperous than people have been before.
There's so much we want to talk about there. The fact is that we give much less than anyone imagines we give in this country. Maybe before I leave that subject, and because I'd like to try and round up in the next 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, Americans have this incredibly inflated idea of how much of federal government spending goes to foreign aid. There have been repeated surveys over different years where people are asked, so do you think the federal government spends too much or too little or about right on foreign aid? And quite a lot of people will say, too much. And they're then asked, so how much do you think the federal government does spend as a proportion of government spending, as a proportion of the federal budget? And the average figure that people come up with, it varies a bit in these surveys, but it's somewhere between 10 and 20% of federal government spending they think goes on foreign aid. So then you ask these people, okay, so how much, you said you think the federal government spends too much, how much do you think the federal government should spend of the federal budget on foreign aid? And they say, oh, maybe 5%. That's a pretty typical answer. Well, in fact, the federal government spends less than 1% of its total spending on foreign aid. So we're much, much less generous than we are. And as a percentage of gross national income, which of course is a different figure from percentage of the budget, we're spending something like 20 to 25 cents. It varies a bit from year to year. So, maybe a quarter in every $100 that we earn goes on foreign aid. Then we top this up a little bit with charitable donations, but very little of that goes on foreign aid too. The largest slice of it goes to religious institutions. Then people give to their educational institutions. Quite a lot goes to culture and the arts. It's, again, a very small fraction.
In that book, you advocate very strongly we need to change and start supporting poverty at much greater levels than we do, and donate money to causes that really address poverty rather than other things directly.
Yeah, I think we need to think more about effectiveness. Which are the charities that are most effective?
Perfect, because the next book and the last one I want to talk about is a book, The Most Good You Can Do, which is effective, which discusses something that's become known as effective altruism, which I guess I would call scientific philanthropy. Do you agree?
I don't mind that term, but I think you're too late. I think you've missed the boat. Effective altruism is around now.
I don't care. I don't have any...
But yes, I mean, exactly. What it is doing is looking at careful studies of which forms of aid actually work to reduce poverty. And this is, again, not something that you can do intuitively. You just don't know until you really do proper studies, until you do randomized trials, for example, of different techniques to see what really makes a difference. And it's because of that we've learned, for example, that microcredit, which was so much in vogue a few years ago, isn't a panacea. It may help some people, but it's definitely not a panacea for helping people to escape from poverty. On the other hand, distributing bed nets against malaria in regions where malaria is a big killer does work. It works very effectively, and we are dramatically reducing the number of child deaths from malaria as a result of doing that.
But what you're advocating is more extreme than that, which is clearly a reasonable thing to do, to look at the effectiveness of the philanthropy that you're trying to do if you're trying to address poverty. But in that book, you actually describe how it's the most good you can do, that people need to basically consider actively designing their lives to make sure that a significant fraction of their income goes to helping others. And doing so in a kind of strategic way. You begin the book with a discussion of this guy, Matt Wage, who took your course in practical ethics in Princeton University. And he was a wonderful philosopher, but instead he took a job on Wall Street in an arbitrage trading firm specifically so that he'd earn a higher income so that he could give most of that away. And that sounds laudable, but when I think about it again, it's an amazing thing to ask people to do, to choose a career to earn a lot of money specifically so they can give most of that money away. But the question I also have, though, is he doing more harm by choosing that career? Let's say he was doing junk mortgages, is he hurting more people by making money than he is helping? So it seems to me it's a more subtle question.
So let me say first, I didn't ask him to do that. It was a choice that he worked out for himself, in discussion with others. And there's a website that discusses ethical careers called 80,000hours.org, if you want to look at it. But he decided that could be a good choice for him, that it would enable him. So within a year of graduation, he was donating a 6-figure sum to effective charities, living modestly and donating a large part of his salary. He's now about 4 years out. He's continuing to do that. He says that he enjoys the work as well. He finds it quite stimulating, has a sort of mathematical component to it, and as well as being good at philosophy, he was good at math. And his view is that I specifically put that question to him when I saw him last April. He doesn't think that what he's doing is harming people. He's not denying that some people and some positions in Wall Street might be. But as you said, it's an arbitrage firm that it's actually buying and selling commodities on the basis of predictions as to whether their prices are going to rise or fall. It's not a huge firm, so it's not making billion-dollar transactions that could distort markets, but it does make money by doing that. And his view is that actually just smooths out. If their predictions are right, it smooths things out. So they will sell when something is going to fall, and that means it starts, instead of having an abrupt fall later on, it has a smoother decline now, and similarly. So he thinks it's harmless, and it enables him to do a lot of good.
But you say, and related to the last discussion we had, in a world that has overcome extreme poverty and other major problems that face us now, promoting the arts would be a worthy goal. In the world in which we live now, however, for reasons that will be explored in the rest of the book, donating to opera houses and museums isn't likely to be doing the most good you can do. And then in that context, you point out that those lectures you gave at Yale, endowed by someone who was in fact promoting, in some sense, the arts, and that was an interesting statement to make. But you pointed out that Princeton's where you teach, its endowment is, what, $21.3 billion. Yale is $20 billion. So that they would be fine, even though it was nice that this person did it, they'd be fine if you didn't donate. But the thing I want to say is when you donate to these places, say you're donating to research that's going to overcome malaria.
Sure.
Surely, yeah. But really the point it seems to me that you're really making is if you want to donate to institutions that you think are going to do good work, you shouldn't donate to institutions that are going to be marginally affected. So what you should do is donate to Arizona State University and not to Princeton. Do you agree? Do you agree?
I think if you're going to donate to universities, you ought to be pretty specific in your donation, because there are, any large university does some good things, some very good things. We won't specify which ones, of course, here. You'd be too modest to do
absolutely.
that, I'm sure.
I'm known to be modest, actually.
But there are some very good things that universities do, and there are some things that essentially are not effective uses of their money. So I think you have to be pretty specific if you want to do that.
Okay, well, as we get near the ending, I want to, of this part, before we give you a chance to ask questions, we talked about the life you can save. Let's talk about the life you can end. And end on that, a brief discussion of who has the right to kill themselves.
Well, I think that essentially that choice ought to be ours if we are competent, rational, and if we have a serious reason for doing so. And a serious reason, thank you. A serious reason obviously would be if we're terminally ill and we've judged that the quality of our life from this particular point on is not likely to be one that we want to have to endure. We could debate whether an incurable but not terminal illness ought to be a similar ground. I'd be inclined to say it is, but the way the legislative changes happen in the United States, it has been focused on terminal illness. I think that this is, again, something that is spreading. It came, in the United States, it came first to Oregon, I think in about 97 or something like that. Then Washington State, neighboring state, which saw what was happening there. Montana through a court decision. Vermont, and just now, the last week or two, Governor Brown in California signed the legislation that was passed there. So once we see it happening, I think, in California, people could say, oh, those states up the Northwest, they're a little different, Vermont or whatever. That's not for me. But once you see it happening in California, a very large, very diverse state, and if, as is certainly the case in Oregon and Washington and so on, if this happens and people there want it, they support it, there's no real signs of it being abused, of it extending to other cases where you wouldn't want it to extend to, then I think, just as we've seen with same-sex marriage, we're going to start to get that happening across the country. I mean,
this is a deep and subtle issue that deserves more time, because, the question when you say serious, you have to ask who determines it's serious. Is it a teenager who's depressed? Is that serious, or is it? So there are a lot of interesting questions which I hope will raise and think in your mind. But what we've learned from this ending life is that, it's a complicated and subtle issue, but sometimes you have to do it, and that's what we have to do right now. We have to end this, even though I think we could go on for a long time, and I could listen to Peter for a long time. So we'll take a break, but let's thank Peter. And we'll see you in a few minutes. Bring the questions down. Thanks, Peter.